Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing well. In today's video, we're going to go through Chapter 1, Psychology is a Way of Thinking. And so in this chapter, we're going to go through two major sections. We're going to talk about research producers and research consumers, the people who are making research and the people who are viewing or taking in research. And understanding the roles and benefits of each of those. We also want to take a look at how scientists approach their work. What is it that makes a good scientist? How are they creating research? What steps are involved? That sort of thing. And so first we're going to go through our research producers. And so a research producer is someone who's seeking to conduct and share research studies. So someone in the department who's conducting research, who's doing experiments and publishing work, that's going to be a research producer. And these producers are important for people taking courses because they're producing the content that we're learning about. They're important for graduate school, so people coming into graduate school wanting to get a master's and or a PhD, they're going to be partaking in producing research, which requires there to be existing research to join in on. And it's also important for wanting to work in a research lab. So even if you don't want to necessarily be a graduate student, maybe you want to be a research assistant, someone who's going to go in and partake in lab work. Maybe you're going to run a lab or be the person that puts on these EKG caps or something like that. It all requires that there is research being produced. So our next group are the research consumers. These are people that are seeking to apply scientific findings to aspects of their lives. And that's pretty broad because pretty much anybody could read and then start applying research and findings to their lives. So we have, again, this is important for courses because you as students are consumers. You're learning about and potentially applying all sorts of different research and information that's been gained through research. So reading articles based on research means that you are a research consumer. And then the point of the first couple of chapters, at least, is to try and get us into this idea of using sort of evidence-based thinking, or here we start talking about people who might start employing evidence-based treatments. So if you're someone practicing as a psychologist or you're working with people, you might want to start applying some of the stuff that you've learned through reading and consuming research to try and make some improvements. Maybe you're going to use a treatment to help somebody recover from some kind of trauma. Or it could be something as simple as you read a study that a certain behavior or a certain change helped people be more happy in their everyday lives, and maybe you want to try that out. So all of these are ways that you could be a research consumer and you could make use of existing research. And so next we're going to get into how scientists start approaching their work. What is it that scientists do that make them scientists? So the first thing we should consider is the fact that scientists are empiricists. And if something is empirical, it means that it's something that we can sort of observe and critically evaluate. So as empiricists, scientists are observing and critically evaluating things in the world. Scientists are going to test theories, and we're going to touch on the theory-data cycle. Scientists tackle applied and basic problems. We can break research into it being either applied or basic. And scientists dig deeper, so they're not going to be content with just the first answer. They're going to want to understand it even deeper. Scientists make it public. We are going to touch on the publication process. And lastly, scientists talk to the world. So not just scientific publications, but also getting into the popular media as well. And so we're going to go through each of those points one at a time and get a little bit more detail there. So like I said, empiricism is when you're using evidence from the senses, so something you can observe, as the basis for conclusions. So you can critically evaluate things that you're observing. So this is going to tie us into the empirical method or empirical research, which is a big part of scientific study or the scientific method. And we're going to go into this in a lot more detail in Chapter 2. So an empiricist is not going to base conclusions on sort of wishy-washy things like intuition or casual observation or hearing someone make a claim. They're going to critically evaluate different sources and make critical conclusions. So for testing theories, we can talk about the theory data cycle. So this is a cycle where you can ask questions based on theories and then make predictions based on those questions you've asked, and then collect and reflect upon data and refine maybe your theory throughout the process. So your theory shapes your questions, and the outcome of those questions can in turn shape your theory. So you can kind of visualize this cyclical process. And the textbook uses the example of maybe troubleshooting the inability to get onto the internet. Maybe you can't use your email right now. So if you're on your phone and you try and load your email and it's not coming up, you can go through the steps of diagnosing that problem. Maybe your theory is that there's something wrong with the Wi-Fi on your phone. So you can turn the Wi-Fi off and on again and see if that fixes the problem. Maybe you could check another device and see if that has wireless. So your prediction or your theory is that there's something wrong with the Wi-Fi, but if a different device is working just fine on the Wi-Fi, then you have to refine your theory. Okay, well, maybe it's not the Wi-Fi, maybe it's the app on your phone. So you can start over again with a newly refined theory and go through that process again. And for those who are visual learners, we can use this diagram here. So you start with a theory, and that theory is going to start influencing our questions. So we can talk about a theory as a set of statements that describes general principles about how variables relate to one another. So it's going to be an overarching explanation of some observations that we think go together. So our theory is our broad explanation. Our theory leads to the research questions, the questions that we're putting together. We can design our research to answer those questions. So we want to figure out what we want to ask and what we'd expect to see. And that expectation brings us here to our hypothesis. And a hypothesis is a specific prediction about the outcomes of research based on theory. So here, a theory is a lot broader, tying together multiple observations, but a hypothesis is a specific prediction that's coming from that theory. And from that hypothesis and using the experiment that we've designed or the research we're going to carry out, we can start collecting data, a set of observations. And so these observations will either lend support to our theory. So if it supports what we had predicted, so if our hypothesis is shown to be true, then we can lend support to our theory and continue again to get more support and more support theoretically. In practice, what's more likely is that the data doesn't quite match up with what we expected. And so you end up with non-supporting data. So you'll have to revise your theory or improve your research design. So sometimes your data doesn't match what you hypothesized, but in some cases it's actually because your research setup wasn't ideal. Maybe you thought you were testing one thing, but when you get your results, it wasn't quite doing what you thought it was going to do. And so you can revise your methods and try again to see if it was actually the experimental setup or if it's your theory that's wrong. And so you can change up your research design here, or you can go back to the drawing board and start tweaking your theory. So you can revise and fix one of those two stages. And this is our theory, sure I say it right, our theory data cycle. And so we could use an example to illustrate this. And a famous example out of psychology is looking at theories of mother-infant attachment. So one theory was the cupboard theory, and the other was the contact comfort theory. So for our cupboard theory, the idea is that an infant would treat the mother as a cupboard. So mother is valuable specifically as a source of food. And so our hypothesis, we would say that classical conditioning is leading us to this association between the mother and the feelings of getting food. So you like the mother because it provides food and food is good. So our cupboard theory has this view, and in the experiment that Harlow tested, so back in the 50s, Harlow had wanted to tease apart whether the cupboard theory was more accurate or our contact comfort theory was more accurate. And so the cupboard theory side of the experiment was providing a wire mother, so a stand-in for a mother, who provided milk. You can't really see it here, but there's a bottle of milk, so providing food for an infant monkey. And if the monkey only values the mother for the food providing aspect, then they should show preference for the wire mother that provides food. But we have a competing theory that we should consider. So the contact comfort theory on this side here, the idea is that the mother is valuable specifically because they provide comfort. So the infant would take comfort in their warm, fuzzy fur. So the contact comfort theory says it's not about the food, it's about the feeling of comfort. And so if we wanted to support the contact comfort theory, then the infant would spend more time on the comforting, the soft fuzzy model, instead of the wire model that provided food. And the image here expresses this pretty well. So the monkey spends most of their time on the fuzzy mother. And so what the monkey would do is whenever they got hungry, they would leave the fuzzy comforting mother, they'd go to the wire mother and eat, and then immediately return to the fuzzy comforting mother. And so these tests provided evidence that supported the contact comfort theory and provided evidence that did not support our cupboard theory. And you'll notice that I'm being very careful not to say that we have proven the contact comfort theory. The reason I'm doing that is because in science, it is very, very difficult to give concrete proof. We can provide evidence that supports that theory, but researchers are always very careful to acknowledge that there could be something else going on here. There could be a better explanation. There could be more here. So we never know the full picture. We can never prove something, but we can have lots of really good evidence in support of it that makes us a lot more confident about that theory. So just something to keep in mind, that when you're talking about research and evidence, you're never going to say that something is proven. You're going to say that there's support for, or there's not support for. You don't use as harsh language, and we'll come back to that a little bit later as we talk about good science and thinking critically about other sources of information. But first, we want to talk about what makes a good theory. So if we're talking about our contact comfort theory versus our cupboard theory, what else are we seeing that's consistent between theories that makes a good theory? So the first point of a good theory is that it should be supported by data. So this is one of our most important features. You don't want a theory that doesn't fit with what we already know about the world. So after Harlow had done his research on contact comfort versus cupboard theory, it wouldn't be a good idea to keep going with the cupboard theory because that theory isn't supported by the data. The next thing that makes a good theory is that this theory should be falsifiable. So a theory should be able to lead us to hypotheses that, when we start testing them, actually fail to support the theory. There should be the possibility that what we're looking at could be given evidence against that theory, and that there could be something else that's responsible for it. And again, the textbook has an example where they talk about the idea that the government monitors people's thoughts, and using tinfoil hats can protect you from monitoring. It's a really bad theory because we can't really falsify that because we have no way of showing that someone's thoughts are being monitored or not. So because there's no way to falsify or show evidence against that idea, it's not really a good theory. Of course, there are other reasons why it's not a good theory, but we'll leave it at that. Our next trait that makes a good theory is that theory has parsimony. And so parsimony is the idea that if everything was equal, the simplest solution would be the best. And you might have heard this described as Occam's razor. So if a simple theory predicts the data just as well as a more complicated theory, then you should really go with that simpler, more parsimonious theory. And the idea here is you shouldn't complicate things unnecessarily, because the more factors that you add into it and the more things and moving parts that you have to consider, the less and less likely it is that that's what's going on. You're better off with the simplest explanation. That doesn't mean that a simple explanation is always correct, but when we are systematically approaching research, it's always a good idea to start at the simplest options. And then if you find evidence or research or support that your simple theory is incorrect, then you could move on to something more complicated that you can test again. But you just want to start at the simplest, most parsimonious option and progress from there. And then the last thing, we come back to this idea that you don't prove anything. A theory doesn't prove something. And for all of the reasons that I explained on the last slide, but scientists are going to be evaluating theories specifically based on the weight of the evidence. How much evidence do we have for or against a theory? How much support do we have for it? And how much evidence do we have that goes against that theory? And then we can make a conclusion that way. And I guess another thing to consider is that when we're weighing this evidence, when we're considering all of these factors, as new research arises, as more evidence piles up, we will also start modifying and reevaluating our stance. Theories change, they'll adapt, be revised over time as we have more and better information. So more science leads us to better theories, and it's a cycle of improvement, which is pretty great for science, that it's going to progress that way. So next we're going to get into the idea of tackling problems, and we had phrased this earlier on as tackling both applied and basic problems. And the reason we want to talk about this is there are two very broad types of research. The first type of research is applied research. And this is research that you're going to conduct in order to solve a practical problem. So the findings of this research will be directly applied to finding a solution to a real-world problem. So for example, people could be conducting research that is looking at what is the best way to teach statistics in university. What is the best way to present this information for the students to absorb it and start applying it and do well in that course. So you're looking at methods of course presentation with the specific goal of fixing the problem of maybe poor performance in statistics courses. So it is an applied type of research. The other kind of research is called basic research. And with basic research, your goal is to enhance the general body of knowledge about a particular topic. So this is going to be knowledge for the sake of knowledge. You're learning things not because you have a specific problem that you need to solve, but because you want to know that information. So a good example of this is people are interested in learning how nautili see. And this is one of my own interests, but cephalopods have very interesting eyes. So they have a pretty decent vision and they can see lots of different shapes and colors and textures and things like that. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I don't believe they can see color. But again, this is just me being interested. But their eyes don't have lenses and don't function the way that human and most other species' eyes work. So there are a lot of researchers who are curious how their eyes work since they're so different from what we're used to. And so this curiosity, this desire to know how they work, isn't going to solve a particular problem, so it's going to be basic research. But the cool part is that basic research can be a foundation for applied studies. So as we're learning these things for interest's sake, we might not know how we could apply that knowledge, but once we have it, it might lead us to find applications. So maybe it turns out that the way that different cephalopods see is really helpful for us in making a new type of camera that doesn't need a lens, which might be really cool for taking pictures in high-pressure environments or something like that. And this transition from basic to applied research can also be called translational research, where you're bridging basic to applied research so you can have findings from basic research used to develop other applications. And you could look at it like this. So you have basic research leading us into translational research, potentially, and translational research leading to applied research. And again, potentially. Sometimes basic research is always going to be basic research and it might not have an application, but we never know until we have that information. So our next point was that scientists dig deeper. And I mentioned that scientists are very rarely satisfied with one answer. So it's very rare to see a scientist that will conduct a single experiment, get some results, maybe some evidence for or against their theory, and then they just stop there. Usually, each study, each collection of data, each evaluation of the results leads to new questions. And so you end up with not a single study, but a series of studies that are trying to get at deeper and different and evolving questions. And that's how you end up with researchers who have entire careers looking at topics that are sort of related to one another, but not quite the same. So there's almost always the next step or the next thing that we can ask or the next refinement that we can make. And then that brings us into publication, where scientists make their findings public. And so the publication process is something that actually isn't really well known for people who aren't doing research. It's not something that's always discussed in different classes. So we're going to take a minute and actually talk about how publication works. So for the publication process, it basically starts with a researcher conducting some kind of research. And they're going to get some kind of findings that are going to give them some kind of evidence, either for or against a theory. So if that researcher wants to share what they've found, they're going to do so by writing up a paper, a scientific article detailing their research. And so in this process, when you write up a scientific paper, they're going to go through all of those steps that you've seen when writing a scientific paper, maybe as far back as doing a lab report in grade school. But they're going to have some kind of introduction. They want to give the reader enough information about the field to know why they're conducting this research and what the field looked like other than their research. What have other people done in this area, and what gaps are they trying to fill or address by doing this experiment? They're then going to give a detailed account of their methods. They want to tell others how they set up this experiment. What were they testing and how were they testing it? And this is important because it helps you understand their results, what the information came from, but it also gives us a chance for other researchers to try and conduct similar experiments. And we'll talk about it throughout the course, but if others can conduct a similar experiment and they get results that are close to what the original study found, you could say that you have replicated that original study. And by having that study replicated, where other people using other sets of data have gotten similar results, that's going to give you even stronger evidence and more confidence that your theory is supported. So that's methods. You're then also going to have an outline of your results. What did you find and how did you find it? And that's where we get into the statistics and all the specifics of what you did with your data to make the conclusions that you're making. And we'll delve into that a lot in this class. And then our last section is going to be our discussion or our conclusions, where we bring it all together. We talk about what we found, what the results are telling us, and how those results sit in that field of information, in what this area of research knows or suspects from other research. So you just sort of put it into perspective. How does it all work together? And so those are the basic steps of putting together a scientific paper. And again, we'll go through this quite a bit more detail later on in the course. But once they have this paper that's giving all of this information to other researchers, these scientists can submit that paper to a scientific journal. And a scientific journal is going to be very different than what we might think of when we talk about a journal. So a scientific journal is a periodical, so kind of like a magazine. It's going to be published every month or maybe every quarter or every year. It varies based on the journals, but these journals are collections of specifically scientific articles. And the important part, the thing that we care the most about, is that articles in these journals are peer-reviewed. And they're also written by qualified contributors. So our qualified contributors are the researchers who actually did the research. And for peer review, that's when you have scientists who are also experts in that field or related fields who are going to read over this paper before the journal decides to publish it. So if you want an article published, if you want to make it public, another scientist, usually 2 or 3 or sometimes even 4 other scientists in your area, have to look at that paper and say that, yes, this is a good study, the science was well conducted, you haven't made any poor assumptions, you haven't cut any corners or done something wrong, this is a solid, well conducted piece of research, and the journal should publish it. And so this review from your peers allows you then to post that in the scientific journal. So the journal's editors will take that review into consideration and say yes or no, we will have your paper. And then after that review, if you're lucky, your paper will be published. And once things are out in these journals, then other scientists can read them. People who are curious about this topic can search it, find it on the internet, read your abstract, and maybe read the full article. Though it's not very often that the public or the general public or non-scientists will decide to go out and read up on research, but we'll come to that. And this is where we come into scientists talking to the world. So having our research reach non-scientists. And the thing that usually bridges the gap between a scientific journal and your research reaching the public is going to be through journalism. And so journalism is going to be referring to our popular media or popular press, stuff that's written for non-scientists, for the general population. And articles in, say, the newspaper or a blog or whatever source are written by journalists. So not scientists, but people who write for a living. And their audience, the people they're aiming to give this information to, is our general public. So again, non-experts. And so there are some risks and benefits associated with having your work brought to the general public. The first thing that we have to consider is journalists are going to usually find out about their research by either reading it in some article. So maybe they're going to browse through some scientific journals and find it and decide to write about it. Or maybe they're going to attend some professional conference where they hear you speak about this topic and it gets them thinking that this would be something good to pass along. But in order to pass that information to the general public, they have to convert or adjust that information so that it's going to be accessible for a wider audience. And so that usually means swapping out some of your scientific terms and the jargon that's included for a field and replacing it with more simplistic terms, something that you don't need a background in that particular field to understand. And if the journalist has a really good grasp on this concept, if they've done their research and they know what they're doing, that conversion can be a great way to get that information to the public. But what often happens is that journalists can oversimplify. They can take some liberties with the facts presented in your paper and start making claims and things beyond what you're actually saying in your research. So the things that we need to consider when we start looking at these journalist articles, we have to ask, is the story important? So why did the journalist actually pick a story? Did they choose it because it was good science, because it was well conducted, because it was something that has importance in the field? Or did they pick it because it was cute or eye-catching? We have to, when we're thinking critically and evaluating the articles that we're looking at, you have to watch out for what's called sensational reporting, which is where journalists will pick something because they think it's going to make an eye-catching headline. And so there will be a lot of people that talk about things that the public likes. So people love dogs and cats. So if they find research about dogs or cats and they can slap a cute picture on the front page, then they're going to get more people reading it. So they're going to be more likely to modify that article. We should also, when reading journalism, ask, is the story accurate? So even if the journalists did read the original scientific article, how did they interpret it? Did they simplify it too much? Did they do a good job of that? Did they draw conclusions that are beyond what the research is able to support? And again, a lot of times that's what ends up happening. And a great example of this is called the Mozart effect. And so some of you might hear that and think, oh yes, I've heard that listening to classical music, usually specifically Mozart, makes children smarter. And so young babies should be hearing classical music because it helps them be smarter and helps their brains grow. And that is a case of a sensationalized story that was drawn from existing research, but the journalist who did that conversion to the general public ended up stretching some of the conclusions made in the original article. So the original article talked about a very specific memory test, and the fact that there was a benefit for a group that listened to Mozart, but only for a very short period of time and only for one specific memory task. And yet, the article that went out to the general public talked about the fact that listening to Mozart made people smarter, and it led into an entire field of people creating CDs specifically for babies with the intention of making their children smarter. So a lot of studies can end up spiraling out of control. And they include an interesting comic that highlights just the frustration that as a researcher you might experience in this situation. So they call it the Science News cycle. And you start at the top with your research. And so we make a conclusion that A is correlated with B, given condition C, assuming D, and under E. So you're saying that, yeah, A relates to B in some very, very specific situations. So think of yourself as this scientist who's found this conclusion, and it's, it's okay. We found a thing that might be a thing, but we should look into it more. Maybe the university PR office sends out a tweet that says, hey, somebody in our office has published. You should read this paper. And so they're saying that scientists are finding a link between A and B. And they do an okay job the first time around. They say under certain conditions, there's maybe a link between A and B. That's not too far from what you said the first time around. But then somebody else gets a hold of it and they're like, oh, A causes B. And this cause is a word that we'll talk about in detail as we go through different types of research. But there's a very big difference between two things being correlated and assuming that one causes the other. So keep that in mind as we go through the course. And then the internet goes nuts with it. And, scientists are out to kill us again. A always causes B. What you don't know about A could hurt you. And all of this sensationalism. And it comes back to, maybe you hear it from your grandma that something has gone terribly wrong and they're worried about A and B and all the problems that could happen. And so, of course, it's a cartoon exaggerating what's going on, but this is actually fairly true for people I know who have done research that's been picked up by popular sources. It spirals very quickly to the point where people start talking about things that aren't even related to what your research was about to begin with. So a kind of funny way to wrap up all about how journalism can be both good and bad in terms of research. And that's going to bring us to the end of chapter 1, which is just dipping our toes into what scientists are doing and how they're doing it, and a little bit about the scientific method. And we're going to continue on with this and expand on this into chapter 2, which will be our next video.